Well, welcome once again to the Ahern video podcast. Today we want to talk about part 2 of crossing the finish line, the contract to purchase. Last week I discussed the fact that you must be able to get your advisors to understand that it's their job to make sure that, one, they don't run up the legal meter, and two, they get you across the finish line. Today I want to discuss the components of the contract, because the components of a purchase agreement may hinge on several other factors. For example, if you're an owner that plans on selling your business and staying, then there's another component to the business, and that's the employment agreement. Sometimes it may be incorporated in the purchase agreement, but normally it's not. It's a separate and distinct contract. Well, as you're reviewing the purchase agreement, it's very important that you also have the contract for employment to make sure that it coincides with your entire thought process. You can argue about the purchase agreement all day long, but if you've talked about a range of values that you're going to receive as compensation, any type of bonus, and you're not reviewing that simultaneously, you could be wasting a lot of time. And the third component is, in some instances, if you own property, 99% of the time, not all the time, but 99% of the time, that buyer is going to want to lease the property with an option to purchase. We are not in the real estate business. We are not real estate advisors. We don't get involved in real estate negotiations. But the first thing you have to do is understand what the market value of that property is. It doesn't make any difference what you are charging yourself. You may be overcharging. And if you're overcharging, that should be taken into consideration when they're calculating the goodwill portion of your business. On the other hand, if you're undercharging, you're going to have a problem, because if you're undercharging and you want to increase the rate significantly, then it's going to impact their financial forecasting. So let's talk about the employment agreement quickly. If there's an employment agreement that's going to be attached to the contract to purchase, in other words, the employment agreement ties into you selling the business, then you have to look at the contract. But understand this, there's always a termination for cause. What a buyer doesn't want to do is turn around and give you a lot of money, and then you sit back on your laurels and you don't work to continue to improve the processes and continue to generate additional income, revenue, and bottom line profits. So consequently, you have to understand that there's no contract that's going to provide you 5 years of an employment contract unless you perform. I've seen attorneys argue and argue and argue about this. And the bottom line is, it doesn't make any difference whether you're arguing or not. An employer has the right to terminate you if in fact you don't perform. It's just a fact of life. So as you're going through the employment agreement, you simultaneously go through the purchase agreement. The purchase agreement is going to have many components in it, but if you're relying on what you're going to get after the fact as far as compensation to stay with the business, then that becomes an important part of your decision-making process. Since you've agreed to a pool of money to sell the business, you have to make sure that the discussions that you've had to date are now memorialized in the agreement. Don't wait until the last minute to sign to review an employment agreement. You should receive the employment agreement, if you're going to be employed, along with the purchase agreement. And those two things are very critical. And the third thing is, if there's going to be a lease on the property, then you also want to have the lease reviewed, because these are all components of your decision-making process. Now, normally in the due diligence process, and normally in the negotiations of a range of values for the purchase of the business, all of these things are going to be discussed and should be agreed to. But you have to make sure that what you thought your understanding with is memorialized in the contract and in the lease. Terms and leases are all over the place, but normally they're going to lease a property for 3 to 5 years. If they want to lease it for 1 year, then you have to make sure that you have another avenue, because if they move the property, if they move the terminal facilities or the operations out of that facility in a year, is there a market value for the property? Because if not, then you've got continuing expenses to maintain that building until you can sell it. So these are all the components that you have to look for. In reference to the purchase agreement, if you're a trucking company and you have trucks, it's going to be very important that you go through a process of not only providing individual titles, but releases and or payoffs on each of the properties as of the date of closing. Next week I'm going to discuss in detail the things that can pop up that can cause a deal to go sideways or not close. But I want to leave you with this thought again. The law firm that you hire and the attorney that represents you will either make or break this deal. If you start letting the attorney take control of the situation, you can potentially lose the transaction. There's many good law firms, but there's also some that primary goal is to control the situation. This is your company. This is your livelihood. This is your retirement. So it's up to you to tell your advisor what you want. It's up to your advisor to execute your thoughts. If you don't tell your advisor that and the deal falls apart, shame on you. Until next time, thank you for attending the podcast.